This week in Pure Reinvention.
I want to challenge us. I want to challenge those folks that are listening to do better. And the only way that we do better, bringing this full circle, is to have these courageous conversations.
Episode 72, Yodit Mesfin Johnson, Chief Operating Officer at Nonprofit Enterprise at Work.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this episode of Pure Reinvention, where we create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. Misty, I really enjoyed this interview.
This was a good one. Yodit takes us to a deep level really fast. She digs in. We get some strategy from her. And what I think is great about our podcast is sometimes we offer these high-level strategic kind of conversations, and other times we give you more tactical, business-oriented conversations.
I think with this particular one, and I want our listeners to pay really kind of focus your listening on this one, because there are so many powerful messages that you don't want to miss them. But I think at the same time, we listen for how we can apply some of the really important lessons that Yodit has shared.
I think something you can be sure about is Yodit is an inspiration. She gives us some of those good life lessons and is a podcast worthy of your time.
Yodit is one of those people that makes a difference, and we're really proud to have her on this podcast. Let's take a listen. This episode of Pure Reinvention is sponsored by Pure Reinvention Retreats. This reinvented take on corporate retreats and team building will have everyone involved feeling refreshed and ready to approach their work with a new attitude. Contact us to talk about what you need, when you need it, and why, so we can deliver a completely personalized event for your team. So Yodit, of the 5 steps in the reinvention process, which step do you most closely align yourself with?
Connect.
What is your superpower?
Connecting. I like to think of myself as Spider Girl.
Spider Girl.
Yeah.
Okay.
To cast nets that connect people.
Of all the things that are going on in the world, usually people have one thing that keeps them up at night. What is the one thing that keeps you up at night?
Not dropping the crystal balls.
Yeah. Yodit, tell us a little bit about your business.
Well, depending on the time of day, by day, I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of a nonprofit organization that helps other nonprofits. We provide organizational development consulting and IT and management. And what we want is a nonprofit sector that's vibrant, sustainable, and really making impact. And then on nights and weekends, in addition to being a mom and a wife, I am the founder of Lips and Hips. I started Lips and Hips on my own journey towards finding my best self. And we like to live by the mantra of dream, plan, and do. And so we help women and girls to imagine their best lives, dream it, operationalize it through a plan, and then get to doing what they were purposed for. And most recently, I launched a vegan lip gloss line with 5 girls from the downtown boxing gym in Detroit. And we used the proceeds of that lip gloss to fund those girls' future.
So Yodit, if somebody wants to find out more about your work, where do they go to learn more about what you do?
Lipsandhips.org.
How do we begin this courageous conversation that you have obviously are encouraging others to do?
Yeah, this is an interesting place, kind of this collision of my life that I find myself in as I stretch and grow as a person, a mom, a wife, a leader, a mentor, an activist, is this journey. Always kind of pressing the edges in terms of my own comfort zone. One of the things that we're working on at work, for example, and that is actually cropping up in other aspects of my life, in my son's school district, in church, in our community, is this notion of equity and inclusion and diversity. And it parallels to the journey I've been on, and that is in the way that I'm asking myself and others to have the courage to speak our truths. And the truth is that, for example, we live at a time in our country where we're being affected by and confronting institutional and systemic racism, bias, sexism, and yet I think we all have to challenge ourselves to move, to acknowledge and name that, and then to be courageous enough to tap not just our heads, but our hearts for moving the needle for change. And so what does that mean exactly? For me, it means that at work, we are acknowledging that many of the nonprofits that we work with exist because of inequity, because historically in this country, we have thought about charity as something we write a check and close our eyes or look the other way, or we think about it in the context of the lesser of us. It's not our problem. It's just our problem to write a check to, perhaps. Or if it is our problem, a lot of times it's so overwhelming that we don't actually challenge ourselves to solve it. So maybe people who are listening have seen, if not, I encourage that they would. Daniel Pallotta did a TED Talk called The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong. And one of the things that he brought up was that in the 100 years since the founding of the nonprofit sector, we've not moved the poverty index, not 1%. It was 12% 100 years ago, and it's 12% today. And so Pallotta, and for the sake of this conversation and your audience, I want to challenge us. I want to challenge those folks that are listening to do better. And the only way that we do better, bringing this full circle, is to have these courageous conversations. And I believe they start with our own acknowledgement of our weakness, our frailty, our vulnerability, our fear, right? You kind of have to surface that. It's like admitting that you have a problem is the first step towards recovery, right?
You bring up so many good points that my head is just spinning, but I want to go back to, I think, one of the real basic points is, which is the traditional norm is needing to be challenged in almost every place that we look, whether it's
That's right.
not-for-profit, for-profit businesses.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really curious to understand then, and I learned this from your social media feed where you had posted something about connections. And so you had mentioned that as your superpower and how you really thought about that being an important step that you could relate to in the Pure Reinvention process. Speak about where the word connection fits into what you just talked about.
So connection for me really starts in my formative years. My mom, like a lot of moms, I grew up in Detroit, single parent home, and we made a family. My mom wasn't from Detroit. She was from New York. And we cobbled together. Listeners will appreciate this. We cobbled together through connections, really a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multidimensional family, so to speak. And so it's a part of my DNA, this idea that it takes many, it takes a village, right? And over the years, I found that as life happens and shows up, that sometimes we distance ourselves, right? You either, in the case of women, we tend to make ourselves small, or we don't prioritize our own needs, or shame, fear, doubt, insecurity, and this is true of men and women, shows up and you sort of retreat, right? Maybe you don't have that village or that connectedness. And so for me, it's been my life's journey to stay connected, to really see value. The wealthiest I am is when I think about the people that are in my network, right? When I think about, and so the post that you're talking about is this idea that we're all connected. There's this woman, Louisa Tish, that talks about another great YouTube video that listeners should check out. But Louisa talks about ancestors, both living and biological, and those of us who are living ancestors and historical ancestors. And her description, and I think is so vivid, is this idea that all around us is the energy of those ancestors propelling us towards our destiny, right? And shepherding us in the journey. And that is how connectedness shows up for me, that while I am very clear and passionate about this issue of inequity, I've experienced it as a woman, as a person of color, I also realize that until you and I, for example, Mike, you happen to be a man and you happen to be white, until you and I can make a heart connection and you see me, you won't have necessarily a connection to why it matters that I have an equitable experience in the workplace, in the world, that my babies do, et cetera. Here's another example. When I am finding so many of my network and people that I'm connected to who have become allies and accomplices. My friend Nicole said, I'm an accomplice, which means I have an agenda, right? An ally is sort of supporting you, and the accomplice has the agenda. I loved it. But so many people who don't look like me or don't have the same experiences that are standing in the gap for me, right? That are saying, for example, when Black boys are under attack in this country, that Black Lives Matter, that not everybody in that movement is Black, right? And that not everybody in that movement is a mother, but that my friends, they know my baby, right? They know my baby boy, and they are connected to him. And that connectedness comes from this broader village that I'm talking to you about. At the heart of it is our soul connection. Whether you're a believer or somebody who has a certain faith practice, or you're just spiritual, or frankly, even if you're agnostic, this idea that we are all connected, right? That I am my brother and sister's keeper. We are. This heart piece is about, I can't move the needle on diversity, inclusion, and equity if I can't get to your heart, right? Here's a great story. So we know that there's pay inequity, right, with women. Huge issue. Black women make 65 cents on the dollar, white women 77 cents on the dollar to our male counterparts, even here, right here in Michigan. And yet we have found an interesting statistic that says white male CEO, after the birth of his daughter, gives most of the women on his leadership team an increase. That's a heart connection. Let's talk about the sort of Islamophobia in our country. This is another example. I know some really amazing Muslim women and spent some time at the Arab American Museum really understanding our history. You can't bash Islam to me, even as a Christian, because of that heart connection I now have to folk I know that I call friends, right? And so that's really, when I talk about connection, each day I'm seeing the humanity in the people I interact with, not their pedigree, not their title, not their accomplishments, the humanity in them.
What I'm learning is that we get past what's on the outside to start looking at what's on the inside. I don't
even think you can get to the outside until you acknowledge that you and I are more alike than we are different.
And that, to me, is the heart of it.
That's
and
right.
That is a perspective, right? That's a way you look at the world or choose to look at the world. And I'm going to guess you're going to say that we have the power within us to look at the world that way.
Yeah, you have to. If you want to solve complex issues, this isn't just like kumbaya. This is, if you really want to solve complex issues, let's talk about organizational cultures, right? People talk about organizations as if they're not made up of people. So when we want to shift a culture, and we know that culture cuts strategy every time, we've really got to shift people and the way they're thinking. I mean, this post that you're talking about that came from Seth Godin, what I love about Seth Godin is his acknowledgement that in order to move people along, we need enrollment. We have to have a shared worldview. What was exciting, if we think about the $20 bill, and Harriet Tubman's going to be on the $20 bill, and I'm so excited. She's my shero. But there's also a lot more there, a lot more to that story. And so we cannot think about this heart work as purely you and I loving each other, right? That is not at all what I'm talking about. We have to think about this, about what we're called to do as being part of a transformation. Not, oh, great, we got Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. We're done.
So Yodit, using those examples of really needing to connect at the heartfelt level, how do we deal with things like equity and diversity and inclusion?
Well, courageously, what I'm finding and I'm excited about, first of all, I think we're in the midst of a cultural revolution. And so what I'm excited about is there's less pandering to the idea and more of embracing inequity head on. And I've been around long enough that we didn't really want to do that. The other thing is, for me, equity and or inequity is a much bigger and much more profound conversation than talking about diversity and inclusion alone. So in this region, at least, when you talk about diversity, so often it comes down to race, right? It means black and white. And the way that we've tried to address the fact that there is such huge disparity has been about trying to check a box. And then you go, I did it, I'm done. And so equity is, you got to sit with that for a minute. There's some great graphics. I hope people will Google equity images. Equity acknowledges that there was something broken to begin with. And so the great work that we have to do in this cultural revolution, and the reason why I'm saying it starts with our heart is because you have to have a turning of your heart in order to do the real work of equity, of inclusion, in order to really drill into and acknowledge the painful history of this country and this globe, frankly, as we embrace a globalizing culture, is that we have to get comfortable with sitting with the discomfort.
I told you that we were going to need a seatbelt if you're listening to this podcast, and I was 100% right. Yodit, this is a game-changing podcast for our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mike, I really love what Yodit said about not really being able to connect with anyone until you see their heart.
One of the most impressive messages that I got from Yodit, amongst the many that were there, was Yodit's focus on encouraging people to look for what's more similar rather than what's different. And while there are lots of obvious differences that we can see, what's not so obvious are the similarities. And I believe that is exactly what you're referencing in the heart message is, how are we more alike so that we can connect?
And I think that speaks to our fundamental of simplify and also connect, obviously, but taking those two things. And once you look for the similarities, you can have a better conversation with those people. You're more willing to bridge gaps because you can say, hey, we're alike because we do this the same, or we're interested in X, Y, and Z. Let's not focus on the A, B, and C that isn't alike.
Misty, you just have taken my thought process to a place that it hadn't yet gone. And that is, so thank you for that. It is almost imperative that before we really can understand about connect, we absolutely have to simplify. And we absolutely have to understand the basic core connections, like heart connections that Yodit has reminded us of. That simplification allows us to make the connection.
Yeah, she said something that I thought was really moving, and it was just look for the humanity in people. Before you look for their pedigree or their title or all of their accomplishments, look for their humanity. And that just takes it down to this beautiful baseline for me. And then it seems like nobody is that scary to talk to. It's not so scary to speak up and ask a question and kind of play the dumb person in a room when you can flatten everything and say, yeah, we're just people being curious, trying to be better, trying to move the needle, and go forward that way. What a great equalizer.
So, Misty, for all of us, we almost have to kind of start behaving a little more counterintuitive because we automatically start to trigger in what's different about us. But absolutely, you are correct. The more we can identify, practice, and become more natural at identifying those things where we are more similar, the very basic, simple, core characteristics that we share, the much easier it is to connect and the more valuable our relationship becomes.
Yeah, this was a good one to sip and savor and kind of listen for. Yodit gave us a couple of extra resources in her conversation with you. She mentioned a TED Talk by Dan Pallotta,
right,
a Seth Godin blog post, and her great startup, Lips and Hips. So we're going to add those in a resources section on the email and on our website. So if you go and want to check out some of the things Yodit mentioned, just look for that resources headline toward the bottom of the post.
Podcast 72.
Yes.
And here we are being inspired because of the podcast that we did with Yodit, and Yodit challenging us and giving us something to consider and think about.
Always changing, always growing.
If you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.